February 12, 1988. Black Sea, just south of Crimea. A low winter sun hangs over slate-gray water. The sea is calm, deceptively calm, its surface broken only by the steady white wake of a U.S. Navy cruiser cutting eastward at deliberate speed. On the bridge of USS Yorktown, CG-48, officers stare into binoculars, their faces tight, their breath visible in the cold air. Somewhere beyond the horizon lies Sevastopol, heart of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet, sacred water to Moscow, and Yorktown is sailing straight toward it. You can feel it before anyone speaks, the tension, the sense that steel is about to meet steel. This is not a battle in the traditional sense. No guns are trained, no missiles are armed. Yet every man on these ships understands the truth. One wrong move here could light a fuse that runs all the way to Washington and Moscow. The operation has a name, Innocent Passage. According to international law, American warships claim the right to pass through territorial waters without hostile intent. The Soviets reject that interpretation entirely. To them, this is a provocation, a test, a humiliation carried out within sight of their own coast. And Soviet admirals are already furious. On the Soviet side, alarms are ringing. Radar contacts are confirmed. Orders ripple outward from fleet headquarters. 2 Soviet vessels are dispatched to intercept, the frigate Bezavyetny and the smaller SKR-6, both gray, angular, and built for exactly this kind of confrontation. Their commanders know their mission is not to fire, but to stop. By mid-morning, the ships are in visual range. The American cruiser looms large, its superstructure bristling with radar arrays and antennas. Behind it follows the USS Caron, DD-970, a Spruance-class destroyer, keeping station, matching speed, matching course. Together, they form a blunt statement of intent. On Bezavyetny, the deck vibrates as engines push the frigate forward. Soviet sailors line the rails, bundled against the cold, watching the Americans through narrowed eyes. This is their water, their sea, and yet here come U.S. warships moving with the confidence of ownership. Radio warnings are sent, then sent again. The messages are firm, clipped, unmistakable. You are violating Soviet territorial waters. Alter course immediately. On the American bridges, the warnings are acknowledged and ignored. The ships continue on their plotted line. Minutes stretch, the distance closes. Hulls that once existed only as blips on radar now dominate the horizon. The sound of engines carries across the water. Officers on both sides calculate speed, angle, momentum. Everyone understands what the next step will be if neither side yields. This is the unspoken rule of Cold War confrontation. If words fail, ships will speak. At Soviet fleet headquarters, tempers flare. To allow American warships to sail unchallenged so close to Crimea would be unthinkable. It would be seen as weakness, not just by NATO, but by their own crews, their own citizens, their own political masters in Moscow. The order is given. Shadow them, crowd them, force them out. Bezavyetny accelerates, sliding into position off Yorktown's port side. The Soviet frigate is smaller, lighter, but her captain knows the risks and accepts them. The plan is simple and brutal. Maneuver close enough to compel the Americans to turn away. On Yorktown, the bridge grows quiet. Helm orders are issued in calm, professional tones. Speed is adjusted, course held steady. The American captain has his own orders, just as uncompromising. This passage will continue unless physically stopped. Now the ships are dangerously close, less than 100 feet, then less. Soviet sailors can see individual faces on the American decks. Someone grips a rail harder than necessary. Someone else swallows. The water between the hulls churns violently as Bezavietny edges closer, her bow creeping toward the cruiser's side. The margin for error has vanished. A sudden wave, a misjudged throttle, a fraction of a degree too much rudder, and there will be impact. For a brief moment, it seems impossible that either captain will go through with it. Rational minds should pull away. Rational minds should de-escalate. But this is not about rationality anymore. It is about resolve. Metal groans as the gap closes to nothing. And then, with a shudder that runs through both ships, the Soviet frigate turns sharply, aiming not to threaten, not to warn, but to ram.
The collision does not come with an explosion. It comes with a deep, grinding crack, like a giant wrench twisting metal bones out of alignment. Bezavietny's bow slams into the port side of USS Yorktown. On the American cruiser, sailors stagger as the deck jolts violently beneath their boots. Coffee cups fly, clipboards scatter. Somewhere deep inside the hull, steel shrieks as plating bends under sudden crushing force. The Soviet frigate's anchor gouges into Yorktown's side, tearing paint, denting armor, ripping away railings as if they were paper. For a heartbeat, the ships are locked together. Two Cold War giants, physically entangled in enemy waters. On Bezavietny, the shock throws men against bulkheads. The bow dips, then rises, grinding along the cruiser's flank. Soviet officers shout orders over the roar of engines and tearing steel. The maneuver has worked, contact has been made, but the danger is far from over. One wrong movement now could pull both ships into catastrophic damage. On Yorktown's bridge, alarms flash. Damage control teams sprint to their stations. Reports come in fast, clipped, controlled. Hull breach avoided. Superficial damage only. No flooding, no casualties. Still, every man aboard knows how close they came. The Soviet frigate shears away, her bow scarred and twisted, but her mission unfinished. This was not a warning tap. This was a statement. And the Americans do not turn back. Instead, Yorktown steadies her course, engines humming, wake smoothing out behind her. The message is unmistakable. We are still going through. That is when the second confrontation ignites. Trailing behind, the USS Caron is now targeted by the smaller Soviet patrol ship SKR-6. Faster and more agile, the Soviet vessel darts in aggressively, positioning itself dangerously close to the destroyer's side. The maneuver is bold, almost reckless, but deliberate. On Caron, officers watch the approach in disbelief. There is no room to maneuver without risking a collision or appearing to retreat. Helm orders come sharply. Speed is adjusted. Course held. SKR-6 closes in. The impact comes seconds later. The Soviet ship rams Caron along her port quarter, the shock reverberating through both hulls. Antennas snap, railings buckle. A U.S. Navy lifeboat is crushed and torn away, disappearing into the Black Sea's gray water. Again, no shots are fired. Again, no missiles are armed. But this is no accident. This is a controlled act of violence, Cold War style. From the Soviet perspective, the logic is ironclad. Firearms escalate. Ramming does not. It sends a message while staying just below the threshold of war. It is dangerous, humiliating, and unmistakable, and it can be explained away as maneuvering contact. On American bridges, the calculus is just as cold. To retreat now would validate Soviet claims and undermine the very principle of freedom of navigation. To respond with force would risk open conflict with a nuclear superpower.
So the U.S. ships do the only thing left. They continue. Both American vessels hold their course through the contested waters, scarred but steady, their crews disciplined, professional, and painfully aware that history is unfolding beneath their feet. Soviet ships shadow them closely, sometimes only yards away, daring them to flinch. From Sevastopol to Moscow, Soviet naval commanders are livid. Reports flood in describing American arrogance, provocation, and deliberate violation. Admirals argue heatedly over radio and telephone lines. Some demand stronger action, others warn of disastrous escalation. The political stakes are enormous. This is 1988. The Cold War is thawing, but it is not over. Arms reduction talks are underway. Diplomats speak of reform and cooperation. And yet, here, in the Black Sea, Cold War reflexes still rule the waves. Hours later, the Americans finally exit the claimed territorial zone. The Soviet ships peel away, their mission complete. The sea grows quiet again, as if nothing extraordinary has happened. But both sides know better. Back aboard the U.S. ships, sailors walk past twisted metal and scraped hulls, running gloved hands over fresh scars. These marks will not be hidden. They will be photographed, analyzed, and presented to the world. On the Soviet ships, damage reports are filed just as carefully. The ramming was successful, but costly. Equipment is bent, pride is bruised, and questions are already forming about what this confrontation has truly accomplished. Because while no one fired a shot that day, something critical was revealed. The Cold War's most dangerous moments were not always fought with missiles and bombs, but with nerves, hulls, and inches of steel. And the anger inside the Soviet Navy is far from cooling. By the time the Yorktown and Caron had cleared Soviet territorial waters, word of the ramming incident had already reached Moscow. In the gray halls of the Navy Ministry, Admiral Vladimir Chernovin, commander of the Black Sea Fleet, slammed his fist on the desk. Maps of the Black Sea were strewn across the table, showing the exact paths of the American ships and the points of contact. Each line, each angle, each hull-to-hull collision was a personal affront. "Do you realize what they did?" Chernovin barked at his staff. "2 American ships in our waters, and they dare ignore our warnings." His voice echoed through the chamber, bouncing off the walls like artillery fire. Junior officers shifted nervously under the weight of his gaze. This was no minor incident, it was a scandal. Messages from Sevastopol Fleet Command detailed the precision maneuvers of Bezovyetny and SKR-6. Reports emphasized that the Soviet ships had executed controlled ramming without escalation. The official commendations highlighted courage and discipline, but Chernovin was not appeased. "Discipline is not enough," he shouted. "This is a humiliation for the entire Navy. Orders must be clear. Next time we must not allow them to pass unchallenged." The political layer added another dimension of tension. In Kremlin offices, officials debated how to respond diplomatically. An open protest could escalate tensions with Washington, risking the fragile arms reduction talks under Gorbachev's new policies. Yet ignoring the incident would make the Soviet Navy appear weak, undermining authority in the fleet and among allies. Chernovin's fury was not only personal, it was institutional, national, and symbolic. Back on the Black Sea, the crews of Bezovyetny and SKR-6 recounted the event repeatedly. Sailors described the exact seconds of impact, the vibrations underfoot, and the fleeting sight of American faces staring back at them across the decks. The ramming had been deliberate, skillful, terrifying, but the Americans had not yielded. Some sailors whispered in disbelief. They just kept going. The incident became an obsession in the fleet. Officers pored over photographs of the damage, measurements of hull dents, and even sketches of angles at which the collisions occurred. Technical analyses filled binders, noting how the U.S. ship's size and momentum made them almost impossible to move without risk of their own hull damage. The lesson was clear. In the Black Sea, sheer audacity sometimes outweighed raw power. Meanwhile, intelligence reports reached Washington, D.C. and the Pentagon. Analysts examined Soviet radar tracks, ship logs, and eyewitness accounts. The message from Moscow was unambiguous. The Soviet Navy considered this a violation of its sovereignty. But American commanders reported back with equal clarity. No shots fired, no escalation, passage complete, international law upheld. Yet beneath these reports, a psychological battle had taken place. Soviet admirals, trained in decades of Cold War discipline, were unnerved. The audacity of U.S. ships ramming them in their own waters was a blow to pride. It revealed vulnerabilities in command and control, and it sowed doubt about the Soviets' ability to enforce territorial claims without risking open conflict. By the evening of February 12th, tension had given way to quiet fury. In Sevastopol, Chernovin paced the corridors of the Black Sea Fleet headquarters. He instructed officers to draft contingency plans for future encounters, emergency maneuvers, coordinated patrols, and even proposals for more aggressive intercept tactics. Every commander understood this would not be the last time foreign ships tested Soviet waters. And somewhere deep in the steel of the damaged Bezavietny and SKR-6, sailors marked the scars left by American hulls. The scratches and dents were not just metal, they were a symbol of provocation, of resilience, and of the thin line between peace and war. The Cold War was entering its final decade, but on this February morning, in the freezing expanse of the Black Sea, it had shown its sharpest teeth. Not in missiles or bombs, but in the clash of steel and nerve, leaving fury simmering in the halls of the Soviet Navy. By the following morning, the ripples of the Black Sea confrontation had reached beyond the fleets and the Kremlin. Naval observers, journalists, and intelligence officers began piecing together the story. In Moscow, the incident was reported cautiously to the press as a navigational incident, but insiders knew the truth. 2 U.S. warships had deliberately tested Soviet territorial waters and had been physically intercepted, and worse, 1 frigate and 1 patrol ship had been rammed in response. For the American side, the story was equally politically charged. Pentagon spokesmen framed the events as a routine freedom of navigation exercise, emphasizing that no shots were fired and no sailors were injured. Media outlets in Washington and New York broadcast images of the vessels steaming through the cold gray Black Sea, highlighting the professionalism of the U.S. Navy. Headlines read, "American warships stand firm in Soviet waters." But in the Soviet Union, the narrative was far more bitter. Military newspapers downplayed casualties or damage, but emphasized the audacity of the Americans. Fleet commanders circulated internal memos praising the bravery of crews who had executed controlled ramming maneuvers under extreme conditions, but also underscoring the embarrassment that the U.S. ships had ignored multiple warnings and continued their incursion without hesitation. Across both navies, a new respect and fear was forming. On Soviet ships, sailors whispered about the Americans' calm under pressure, their refusal to flinch despite the ramming. On U.S. decks, sailors told similar stories of the Soviet crew's daring maneuvers, their precision timing, and the sheer nerve it took to get that close without sparking a full-scale engagement. It was a tense ballet of steel, discipline and brinksmanship played out in the gray winter waters of the Black Sea. The incident also sparked heated debates within naval strategy circles. Soviet planners questioned the effectiveness of rules of engagement that restrained their ships from escalating further. Would stronger, more aggressive posturing have forced the Americans to turn back, or would it have triggered a far deadlier confrontation? In Washington, analysts scrutinized the navigational charts, timing, and communications, debating whether ramming tactics posed a serious risk to American vessels in international law contexts. At the same time, photographs and rough sketches of the minor hull damage circulated among Cold War intelligence agencies. The dents on Bezavetny's bow and the crushed lifeboat on SKR-6 became case studies in risk and deterrence. In war colleges, instructors began adding the Black Sea incident of February 12, 1988, as an example of modern naval confrontation without shots fired, a perfect illustration of Cold War brinksmanship. The sailors themselves bore the invisible scars of the confrontation. On both sides, men spoke quietly of the moment when steel screamed against steel, when inches of separation held the line between professional maneuver and catastrophe. They remembered the creaking of hulls, the shouts of officers, the sudden jolt of impact. It would stay with them, a reminder of the unpredictable nature of Cold War encounters. Meanwhile, Moscow demanded explanations at the highest levels. Admirals and defense ministers drafted reports detailing the chain of command, the maneuvers, and the perceived provocations. A tense meeting with Gorbachev's advisors outlined the dangers of American naval assertiveness in Soviet waters. Some voices pushed for retaliation, others urged restraint, citing the fragile state of East-West relations and the ongoing INF treaty negotiations. The Americans, aware of the Soviet fury, conducted their own internal review. Commanders praised the discipline of their crews, noting that the calm professionalism aboard Yorktown and Caron had prevented escalation. They also reviewed the Soviet tactics, acknowledging that ramming maneuvers were bold, precise, and inherently dangerous. In the Pentagon's war rooms, the event became an example of risk management and psychological warfare at sea. And yet, for the Soviet Navy, one feeling lingered above all: anger, fury at the audacity, fury at the breach of what they considered sovereign waters, fury at the American refusal to retreat. The ramming had sent a message, but it had not compelled the intruders to leave. Admirals chewed on this reality for weeks, drafting new contingency plans, new intercept tactics, new rules of engagement, each designed to ensure that next time their waters would not be violated without a cost paid in full.
By late February, the Black Sea incident had settled into history, but its reverberations continued to shape both navies' strategies. For the Soviet Navy, the February 12th ramming incident became a case study in pride, vulnerability, and operational limits. Admirals like Chernovin insisted on new protocols. Patrol routes would be tightened, intercept drills would be intensified, and rapid response maneuvers would be practiced to prevent any future audacity from American vessels. Every officer, from captain to junior lieutenant, knew that even minor miscalculations could escalate a tense confrontation into open conflict. On the American side, lessons were equally stark. The U.S. Navy recognized that freedom of navigation exercises, while legally justified, carried real risks when faced with a fleet willing to physically challenge them. After-action reviews praised the calm professionalism of Yorktown and Caron crews, but also highlighted the dangers of operating in waters where Soviet forces were prepared to ram rather than fire. Briefings emphasized training in collision avoidance, hull integrity, and psychological resilience under deliberate provocation. Diplomats also weighed in. In the halls of the United Nations and in secret back channels, both Washington and Moscow framed their narratives carefully. The Americans portrayed the passage as a lawful operation, emphasizing discipline and adherence to international law. The Soviets framed the ramming as necessary to protect sovereignty without escalating to armed conflict. Behind the scenes, negotiators understood the subtle power of these incidents. In the Cold War, a well-timed bump could carry as much weight as a missile salvo. For historians and military analysts, the Black Sea clash became a defining example of Cold War brinksmanship at sea. It demonstrated how confrontations could escalate without weapons, how discipline and nerve could outweigh raw firepower, and how the thin line between provocation and war could be measured in yards of steel and seconds of timing. Naval academies around the world now teach the incident as a masterclass in controlled aggression, professional restraint, and psychological warfare. For the sailors who lived it, it was deeply personal. On Bezavietny and SKR-6, they touched the dented steel and remembered the shock of impact. On Yorktown and Caron, they recounted the jolt that ran from hull to deck. In quiet moments, many acknowledged a grudging respect for their adversaries, the Americans' refusal to yield, the Soviets' precise maneuvers, and the invisible yet palpable tension that had defined those gray winter hours. And yet, above all, there remained a lesson that transcended hulls, ranks, and politics. In the Cold War, courage and audacity could speak louder than any gun, and resolve could be measured in inches of steel. The Black Sea had been a theater of confrontation without bullets, a reminder that the most dangerous moments were often those where every participant knew a single misstep could ignite a global crisis. For the Soviets, fury simmered, plans were revised, and pride demanded vigilance. For the Americans, discipline was celebrated, lessons were learned, and freedom of navigation remained the guiding principle. And for the world, the incident offered a chilling insight into the fine line between peace and war, where two ships in a frozen sea became the stage for a silent but profound struggle of wills. The Black Sea had spoken, and both sides had listened, if only grudgingly.